At the time, I accepted that was just who Tanya was. Besides, the makeup sex was really great. I think that things changed a little when Tanya wrote 2 new songs, and we recorded them. They went nowhere. Then I wrote a new song, which we recorded, and it had a fair amount of success. It made it up to 17 on the Country 100 charts. For some reason, Tanya was a little snappish to anyone who mentioned the song's success. That surprised me because it was a solo written just for her. But that strange mood only lasted for a week or so, and then Tanya was back to normal. After returning from a short 4-city tour, I decided we needed a break. I talked Tanya into coming with me to Tifton to visit my parents. Not having parents of her own, Tanya was always a little uneasy around mine. So, I was surprised and happy when she actually agreed to come with me to my hometown. I, personally, was keen to visit as I had only been able to spend an odd day with Mom and Dad every so often. Occasionally, they came up to Atlanta to visit for a few days. But we were usually very busy during the day, so we only got to see them in the evenings. I guess I was a little homesick because I hadn't spent any real time in Tifton with my parents and the rest of my family in years. And of course, none of us was getting any younger. When I told my parents about our plans, my mother insisted on throwing us a party to see my relatives. Most of them had only met Tanya at our wedding. It was supposed to be a small affair at my parents' house. However, it quickly grew to several hundred people, necessitating my parents renting the community center. I was frustrated with my mother's ever-expanding party, but Tanya told me to let her have her fun. However, the day before we were supposed to go, Tanya came down with a bad cold. Instead of canceling, Tanya insisted that I go by myself. I checked Tanya's temperature before I left, and it was hovering around 101. After assuring me that she would be fine, I headed south. Of course, my parents were very disappointed that my wife couldn't make the trip, but they were thrilled to see me nonetheless. During the week, I visited with most of my relatives. I also caught up with a lot of my high school buddies, and I called Tanya every night to check on her. By Thursday, she seemed to be getting better but sounded totally congested. The big party was set for that Saturday, and I wasn't particularly looking forward to it. Still, it was something that my mother wanted, and I wanted her to be happy. Anyway, on the way to the party, my mother told me that it would be nice if I sang a few songs. I kind of expected that but pretended to grudgingly agree. But just as we pulled into the parking lot, she floored me with her next announcement. "Oh, Robbie," my mother said as the car came to a stop, "I just want to let you know that I invited Susie and George Menard." "What?" I almost choked. "Why the hell did you invite my ex-wife and her turd of a husband?" My mother just smirked and said, "Spite." When I saw the crowd, I relaxed because I figured that I'd never see them amid the hundreds of people there. Besides, there were many of my relatives hovering around me and a ton of my friends. Still, my hope that I wouldn't run into my ex-wife wasn't to be. About a half hour after I got there, I turned around and came face to face with Susie and George. Susie looked like she had put on at least 20 pounds. The dress she was wearing made her look like 10 pounds of potatoes stuffed in a 5-pound sack. George looked like he was a 70-year-old man, and I knew he was only in his 50s. "Robbie." Susie's eyes lit up. "How are you doing?" The devil on my shoulder was feeding dozens of nasty things to say into one ear. But the angel up there was telling me to play nice in the other ear. The angel won out mostly because I figured my mother would be annoyed with me if I let my temper get loose. "I'm doing great, thank you," I said through a fake smile. "How are you guys doing?" "We're going great also," Susie continued to beam. "George now has 4 car dealerships. He's even more successful than when I married him." "That's nice," I said, wanting desperately to be away from these two, when nothing obvious presented itself, and Susie continued to tell me how great she was doing. The devil won out. "Hey, I want to thank you guys." "Thank us," George said, looking at me quizzically and suspiciously. "Why would you be thanking us?" "Well, George," I said with a wide smile, "if you hadn't stolen my wife, I never would have moved out of Tifton. I never would have found this great career I have now. Instead, I'd be sitting in our old house watching Susie get fat. You guys have a good time." With that, I turned and headed to the other side of the hall. I glanced at my mother to see if she had heard any of the exchange, and she had. However, as I moved past my mom, I could see that she was trying to hide her amusement behind her hands. A quick glance back saw Susie, beet red, giving her husband an earful. The party was actually very enjoyable. I learned that all of my mother's sisters and their friends had put the festivities together, and when the final count was made, 414 people showed up. I know this because I paid for most of the party. There was no way I was going to let my parents pay for a party this big. The day before I was scheduled to return to Atlanta, I got a frantic call from Tanya. Alex had had a heart attack. That was the beginning of the end for Tanya and me. I made it back to Atlanta in record time and thankfully found that Alex would recover fully. But he was very troubled, and he expressed his problem the first day he was back at his office. To him, the heart attack had been a wake-up call. Alex thought it best if he retired. He would stay on until we found someone else, and then he would allow us to cancel the remainder of his contract with us. That was exceedingly generous considering that the contract had 3 years remaining on it, and he really didn't have to do anything during that time except collect his 10%. But that was the kind of guy Alex was. Tanya and Alex did all of the original interviewing of potential new managers. When it came down to 2 candidates, I was brought in for the final interviews. Todd Wilton was a good-looking guy in his early 40s. He had managed several well-known groups successfully. Sonia Hilliker, on the other hand, was a 33-year-old blonde with an impressive resume but only managed smaller groups. However, each group she guided managed to come from nothing to some significance. On the other hand, Todd had only managed to hold his groups at the same level. I was fine with either. However, I thought Sonia was probably the better of the two because she had managed to increase the popularity of her groups. In contrast, while Todd managed his groups well, he hadn't been able to grow them much at all. I wasn't surprised, though, that Tanya favored Todd. I could tell very quickly that my wife didn't care for Sonia at all. I should have fought for my choice, but at the time, it didn't seem wise to bring in a manager that would be butting heads with Tanya right off the bat. Besides, I was fine with either. In the end, Todd was hired. I didn't realize it at the time, but he was a complete dirtbag. For the first 6 months, I didn't notice anything different. Then I began to get a feeling that something was off. Tanya began to spend more time with Todd, supposedly going over the finances or schedules. Then Todd began scheduling personal appearances for Tanya and me separately. He explained that by splitting up, we could cover more ground. It seemed reasonable, even though I wasn't happy with it. My world turned to shit right after the last concert of the most recent tour, and I was completely blindsided by what happened. I felt particularly good that the tour was over and Tanya and I could spend some alone time together. We'd been the opening act for a group called the Down Home Boys. They had gone on tour after scoring their third #1 hit. We had opened for 8 of their 10 shows, and they seemed very happy with us. I had just finished writing 2 new songs that I thought were pretty good and was eager to get back to Atlanta to record them. I wasn't going to tell Tanya about the songs because I wanted to surprise her with her birthday only a couple weeks away. However, after a passionate night of lovemaking, I told her about them anyway. Tanya became excited and wanted to see the songs right away, so I dug them out. Then we played them a couple of times, naked, in bed. Tanya was thrilled with both. By this time in our careers, Tanya and I had perhaps moved to the middle of the B group. I was hoping that my 2 new songs would move us up a little further. I knew that Tanya was becoming less and less enchanted as an opening act. She wanted to be the sole attraction. However, I knew that the chances of that happening were slim, but I thought my 2 new songs would push us a little closer to that possibility. Lord knows that Todd hadn't come up with anything new to help us. In fact, I had checked the schedule for next year, and it was pretty sparse. I remember at the time wondering why Tanya thought Todd was doing such a great job. Of course, I was a trusting fool, and it would come back to bite me in the ass. It was a Monday morning, and we were catching a 10 a.m. flight out of LaGuardia Airport back to Atlanta. Tanya's bags had already been taken down to the lobby, and I was just waiting for someone to come to get mine. Tanya told me she wanted to pick up something at one of the stores and would meet me at the airport. I told her we were cutting it kind of close and not to dawdle. I was just sitting on the bed waiting when a gentleman in a light gray suit appeared at the door. "Mr. Robbie Wilder?" he asked. I nodded. He handed me an envelope and said, "You've been served." I was totally confused and asked, "What are you talking about?" But the man was already gone. I had a sinking feeling as I looked at the envelope in my hand, and when I opened it, my world imploded. Tanya had filed for divorce against me. I sat on the bed stunned for quite some time, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, I was roused from my trance by the bellboy. As the young man was collecting my bags, I started to read through the papers. Tanya was divorcing me, citing mental cruelty and physical abuse. That charge was a lie, and the red-hot anger that filled me actually overpowered my feelings of despair. I had never raised my hand or my voice to Tanya. Why would she make such an outrageous accusation? Right now, however, my only thought was to confront her and ask her why. As I read further, I was stunned to find out that she demanded most of our assets. I kept telling myself that this had to be a terrible mistake. I had to talk to Tanya and get this straightened out, but my call to her cell phone sent ice-cold fear to my heart. Her cell phone was no longer in service. Then it hit me, and everything clicked into place. Todd. All the late nights, the coolness, the snide comment or two, the smirks by Todd when he thought I didn't see. Right then, the red-hot anger turned to white-hot rage. But then, as quickly as that feeling came, I was lost again in a sea of despair. I dropped the divorce papers on the floor, and I was also about to drop the envelope when I realized there was more inside it. Shaking out the other piece of paper, I discovered another legal document, a restraining order. It stated that I was to stay 500 feet away from Tanya. I was also to stay 500 feet away from our home and the studio if Tanya was there. My heart was totally and utterly broken. I couldn't understand any of this. Tanya and I made love the night before, and it had been passionate. Surely, she didn't fall out of love with me in one day. It suddenly hit me like a thunderbolt. Maybe she never loved me at all. My head was spinning, and my stomach was churning, ready to revolt. At that moment, I don't think I was having anything close to rational thought. When the nauseous feeling overwhelmed me, I bolted to the bathroom. When my stomach was finally empty and somewhat calmed, I wandered to the window, looking down at all the people hurrying around below. I envied every one of those thousands of people because they weren't me. If I could have gotten the window open, I might have even considered jumping. I felt like my whole reason for living was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, but suddenly, I needed something to drink. My attention instantly went to the minibar, and I helped myself to one of those mini bottles of scotch. My mind went into a sort of haze by the third bottle, and the pain wasn't as acute. Despite my brain being clouded, the alcohol did calm me and allowed me to begin reviewing my current situation. Yet, every which way I looked, I was totally and completely screwed. I needed to do something, but for the life of me, I had no idea what. The only thing that kept flooding my mind was that I wanted to totally destroy Tanya and Todd. But then I'd flashed back to Susie leaving me and how impotent I had been then. And it looked like, once again, I wouldn't be able to do anything to my betrayers. I grabbed another bottle of scotch and gathered up the papers. I almost tore them to shreds, but instead, I read further. And it just got worse. All of our joint assets had been frozen pending the court deciding a final division. Then I found the final insult, which sent fury racing back through my alcohol-muddled brain. My first-class ticket back to Atlanta had been canceled. It had been replaced with an economy ticket for 2 days later. This was all so cold and hateful. At that moment, pure white hatred of Tanya and Todd filled my being. I wanted them destroyed. I swore to myself that I would have some measure of revenge for the total disrespect and contempt with which they had treated me, even if it took the rest of my life. But, at the moment, I couldn't think of one thing that I could do to hit back at them. I just couldn't get my head around the fact that Tanya had not only betrayed our marriage, but also our business partnership. That wasn't bad enough, but Tanya and Todd were trying to totally destroy my music career. If they could make those abuse accusations stick, I was in deep shit. This was especially true because of the woke generation. The mantra these days was that the woman had to be believed. She had to be believed regardless of whether there is any proof or not. A cold chill ran through me as I suddenly realized how dire my situation was. It became apparent that if I didn't do something soon, they would steamroller me, and I'd be nothing more than a grease spot on the pavement. My first decision was to go online and examine our checking accounts, personal and business. As the court papers said, the accounts were flagged. I had no idea how much should be in the business account, but I knew it should be considerably more than it was. As for our personal account, I knew it was seriously depleted. I had taken money out of an ATM last evening, and I still had the receipt, which showed the balance was almost 3 times what was displayed today. After 2 failed attempts to operate the phone because of my alcohol-impaired brain, I finally reached the front desk. I told them to hold Tanya's luggage there for a bit. I would be down shortly to make arrangements for it. As for my luggage, I asked them to bring it back up because I'd be staying an additional 2 nights. Then I sat back down and started going through the paperwork in detail. I dumped the remaining scotch in the little bottle down the sink. Right now, my anger was overriding my self-pity. Over the following weeks, those 2 emotions would take turns dominating. But at the moment, I was beyond furious. If I wanted to defend myself, I needed a clearer head to plan what I would do next. I read through everything twice and was still outraged by it all. I put the papers aside and decided to take care of Tanya's luggage first. I arranged to have it put into an off-site self-storage unit. I paid for it with a personal credit card that I don't think Tanya knew I had. It was a petty thing, but I had no intention of telling Tanya where her stuff was. Then I called our attorney, Greg Pinder. That was another shock. Greg told me that he had been retained by Tanya and could do nothing for me. I was furious with Greg and lashed out. Of course, you know that this means that I will never use you again, and we are no longer friends, I said testily. Robbie, I'm going to let that remark pass because I know that you're extremely upset at the moment. You think I'm upset, Greg? I asked with cold fury. You have no idea. You were my parents' attorney before you became mine. I was the one that brought you on as our business attorney. And when you decided that you wanted to become an entertainment attorney, I referred clients to you. You knew all this shit was going on, and you let Tanya stab me in the back without a word. You should have stayed out of this and referred Tanya and me to different attorneys. But instead, you've chosen sides. That was a bad decision on your part because I will no longer refer anyone to you. And in fact, I'll advise anyone who asks that you can't be trusted. Are you threatening me? Greg said with some anger. No, I'm telling you to screw off, you piece of shit. I slammed the phone down. I didn't know if I could hurt Greg's practice or not, but I was sure going to try. I knew that he had about a dozen show business clients, and I'd sent 7 of them to him. I also believed that a word to 3 or 4 of them would have them looking for a new attorney. As I raged in my head about Greg's betrayal, it struck me that he probably wasn't the only one who knew what was going on. As I thought back to the people in the studio, they might not have known what Tanya and Todd were up to, but they had to know that Tanya was cheating on me. But Greg and all those other pigs were the least of my problems. This day was just getting worse and worse, and I had to try to stop the bleeding. With my whole world turned to shit, I hit the minibar. But instead of alcohol, I grabbed a soft drink. I needed my wits about me so that I could plan my revenge. Then a small thought struck me. I suddenly realized that the company would still be responsible for the room until checkout time. If I couldn't access any money from the company, I'd force the company to pay for my snacks and drinks, so I called the front desk and instructed them to double stock the minibar. I was in so much emotional pain, and no matter how I tried to understand, I couldn't get my mind around it. If Tanya wanted to be with Todd, all she had to do was to tell me she wanted a divorce. I would have been crushed, but not like this. This was more than just a divorce. There was something else going on here, but I, for sure, didn't know what it was at that moment. However, there was no doubt in my mind that this was all Todd's idea. I really wanted to believe that Tanya didn't really know what was going on, but that didn't make any sense. I had to face the reality that none of this could have started without Tanya's willingness to go along. I just laid there for the next 2 hours, feeling sorry for myself. I did a fair amount of crying. Why was it that women felt like they had to treat me like shit? And I had taken it all my life. I had never really been able to get back at any female that had turned on me. Now Tanya was not only leaving me, but she planned to leave my career in a smoking ruin. And from the wreckage of my career, Tanya was going to make herself bigger and better than before. The hatred and anger filled me until I finally exploded, yelling, "I'm not taking this anymore." I tried to reason through it all. First of all, Tanya and Todd had waited until the end of the tour. I was sure this was done so there would be no chance of a breach of contract, but I didn't understand why they had tried to trap me in New York. Maybe they were going to try to scoop up all the assets before I got back to Atlanta. But what good would that do? In the divorce, the company books would be examined, and everything would be split 50-50ths. Maybe Tanya wanted to claim occupancy of the house. I didn't care about that. She could have it. Maybe they were trying to make me feel financially desperate, so they could approach me with some kind of ridiculous settlement. They had to realize that regardless of what they offered, with what they had done, I wouldn't accept it even if I had to sleep on the street. None of this made any sense. However, the more I thought about them trying to squeeze me into a financial box, I had to admit that it did seem to have some legs to it. But if that was their plan, they had badly miscalculated. I was pretty sure they had no knowledge of my personal accounts. Because our partnership was, in reality, a limited liability corporation, our tax accountant had insisted that we each take a salary. This was to ensure that the IRS would leave us alone. We each received a salary of $6,000 a month. For me, after everything that was required was taken out, I had been putting almost $4,500 a month into a brokerage account. Tanya and I both made personal appearances, and we got paid directly for them. Tanya spent most of her money on clothes, jewelry, and artwork. I instead invested all that money with my broker also. That was just the way I was raised. Anyway, my personal account now had almost $800,000. I not only had an ATM card, but I could call up and have money sent to me directly. Even though the royalties from my songs had slacked off in recent years, they were still bringing in $15,000 to $20,000 a year. And the royalties from these songs were mine. Todd had tried to talk me into putting the songs into the corporation, but I had flatly refused. In the back of my mind, I planned to sign over these songs to Tanya for our 10th anniversary. That, for sure, was not going to happen now. Even though I had booked the room for an additional 2 days, I toyed with the idea of catching a flight that evening back to Atlanta, but I decided against doing that because there was nothing back there for me. Instead, I decided to call our old agent, Alex, and discuss what a mess Tanya and Todd had created for me. "Hello," I heard Alex's familiar voice. "Alex, it's me, Robbie." I tried to sound upbeat. "Robbie, great to hear from you. How are you and Tanya doing?" "Terrible," I responded. "And that's why I'm calling. Tanya has filed for divorce, citing mental and physical abuse as the reason. She and Todd have also slapped a restraining order and an injunction on me. They are trying to cut me off from any company assets and cutting off any discussion between Tanya and me. They've also retained Greg Pinder, so, right now, I'm up the creek without a paddle. I'm not sure what I should do next." "If Greg has truly agreed to represent Tanya, then he has a serious conflict of interest," Alex said forcefully. "But that is something that can be visited later." "I have plans for Greg in the future," Robbie offered. "But I agree, he's a minor irritation right now." Alex was silent for several long seconds, and then he sighed. "I'm sorry, Robbie. I should have said something when you and Tanya decided to get married. I knew you were crazy about her, but I also knew she didn't feel the same way about you. Tanya told me that she was very fond of you, but wasn't interested in getting married. Then I made the mistake of casually mentioning that a wedding could generate huge publicity. Tanya immediately flipped for the idea. I realized right then that while she cared for you, Tanya cared way more for her career. She's the worst kind of publicity bitch. I believe she'd sell her soul to become a superstar." Hearing what Alex had to say just cut deeper into me. As I looked back over my relationship with Tanya, I had been way more in love with her than she ever was with me. In fact, now I questioned whether everything about my marriage was a lie. "Robbie, I know you're in a bad place right now," Alex said soothingly, "but I'll help you any way that I can. From what you're telling me, your marriage is dead. So, what do you want to do now?" The pain that had been growing was overwhelming me. I was totally surprised by the words that flowed out of my mouth. "I want to burn the bitch. She destroyed what was most important to me. I want to destroy what is most important to her." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Alex sighed. "I'm not sure what that means, but I strongly suggest that you just walk away from her. Let the lawyers work out the divorce and the dissolution of the business. You're talented enough to start a career on your own. Don't let this turn you bitter." "Too late to stop that, Alex," I admitted because I was beyond bitter, and I desperately wanted to burn Tanya's soul. I knew that Tanya's greatest desire was to become a superstar, but, at the moment, I didn't have a clue as to how to keep her from becoming one. Chances were that she wouldn't make it regardless of what Todd had planned. But that wasn't good enough for me. Somehow, I had to mess with her becoming a star. That was the way to hit back at Tanya. And if Tanya failed, she'd turn on Todd. That would be fun to watch. "Okay," he said with another sigh. "I'm not sure exactly what you want to do about getting back at Tanya, but for right now, let's start with the basics. I'm going to give you the number of an attorney to handle your divorce. He's a real shark. And I'm going to give you the number of a corporate attorney to battle for your business rights. If you don't have the money, I'll front you the retainers." "No, that's all right. I've got enough of my own money." "Hang on a second, Robbie," Alex said suddenly. "There's something about Tanya on the news." I waited on the phone for a long 2 minutes before Alex got back on. "Todd just announced your divorce, citing physical and mental abuse. He's also announced that Tanya is launching a solo career. They're going to cut a new album with new songs. Todd also announced that they're in the process of planning a new tour for Tanya. They didn't waste any time, did they?" I said with despair. Then I had a horrible feeling in my stomach. Suddenly, I blurted out, "My songs." I dropped the phone and began frantically searching through my luggage for the shoeboxes with my songs in them. Finally, I sighed with relief when I found them, but that feeling evaporated when I lifted the boxes. I realized they were empty. Tanya had stolen my songs. Suddenly, I remembered that Alex was still on the line. "Alex, are you still there?" "Yeah," he answered with confusion in his voice. "What's going on?" "Tanya stole my songs," I said with despair in my voice. "Now it all makes sense," Alex responded. "Todd isn't Pig, but he's a smart one. They stranded you in New York, so they could hustle back to Atlanta and record their new album. And from what I can see, Todd and Tanya are going to try to control the narrative. They will try to elicit sympathy and make you out to be a wife beater or worse. I can get some PR people to help you with that. Just remember to push your side of the story every time you talk to the media. Categorically deny the charges of abuse, and let everyone know how they're trying to steal your portion of the company. I know everything looks really dark right now, Robbie, but don't get discouraged. I'll make sure you can fight back." After I hung up from Alex, I felt more like a man again. Not the eunuch Tanya was trying to make me into. I got all the paperwork together and sorted it out to speak intelligently to the two attorneys. By the time I called them, Alex had already informed them to expect my call. I faxed the legal papers and arranged to have the retainers deposited into their accounts. Now I had nothing to do, and I was stuck in New York for 2 full days and part of a third. Add to this, I hate New York City. It's a dirty, smelly city filled with nasty people. Most New Yorkers I've met are rude, arrogant, and abrasive. Why anyone would want to live here is beyond me. With nothing to do and feeling like the walls were closing in on me, I had to find something to keep me sane. If I stayed in the room, I'd obsess about Tanya and start hitting the minibar again. Instead, I headed out for a walk. I figured I would walk for a bit and then catch a show or something. Anything to take my mind off my misery. The walk was actually pleasant. It was a nice spring day, and the heavy rains last night had cleared the air and cleaned the city to an extent. The temperature was in the mid-60s, and despite the New Yorkers, I was actually enjoying myself. I hit an ATM first and took out another $600. New York is super expensive, and I knew the money wouldn't last long, even with what I had taken out yesterday and today. About the only place in Manhattan that I was familiar with was Central Park. So, I decided to head over there. I wanted to get away from the mad stream of people hurrying to who knows where. I stopped at the top of the stairway down into the park at one of the entrances. A young woman just to the side of the stairs, maybe mid-20s, was playing a guitar and singing. She was wearing a shabby sundress and had stringy blonde hair. She had a pretty face, but seemed kind of on the thin side. In front of her was an open guitar case should anyone want to drop a donation in. Judging from the money there, if she relied on this to eat, it was no wonder she was so thin. I was intrigued because the woman could barely play the guitar, but she had a beautiful voice. I studied her bare arms, looking for the needle marks of an addict but found none. The more I watched, the more intrigued I became. Finally, I reached in and pulled out my wallet. I pulled out $100 and moved up next to her. "How are you doing?" I asked the young woman politely, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "Okay," she mumbled. "Tell you what," I said with a smile. "I'll give you $100 if you let me play the guitar while you sing." "I don't do any weird shit," she said angrily. "Look, I know this is New York City, where everyone is weird, but this is a straight-up offer. $100 if you let me play the guitar while you sing. Of course, I'll probably sing some myself." The young woman looked hard at me, and then she looked hard at the $100. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head. The girl desperately wanted the $100, but she was wondering what else I wanted. "Look, just to be sure that I'm on the up and up," I said to head off her worst fears, "I'll put $200 in your case right now and step over here. If you want the deal, ask someone to hand me the guitar. I'll bet that guitar didn't cost you more than $50. If you don't want the deal, I'll take the $200 back and leave." I tossed the $200 into the case and moved away. After about 30 seconds of thought, the young woman finally asked a teenager to hand me her guitar. I took it and began tuning it. It was old and pretty beat up, so it took a couple minutes to get any kind of a decent sound out of it. I looked over at the young woman and asked her what her name was. "Dawn," she said softly. "Well, Dawn, my name is Robbie. What songs do you know?" She rattled off about a dozen, and I knew all of them. After a few seconds of thought, I decided we'd start off with Amazing Grace. That song touches 90% of the people who hear it. I wasn't sure about New Yorkers, but it would be great if it only touched 50%. We started off a little rough. I had never performed with Dawn, and of course, she wasn't a professional. But quickly, we got in sync, and with Dawn's crystal clear voice and the power I could generate, we started to build a crowd. The donations started to drop in. The crowd continued to grow until there had to be about 30 or 40 people around us. After about an hour and a half, I saw her looking at her watch. "I've got to go," Dawn announced suddenly as she jumped to her feet. "What's the rush?" I asked. "People are just starting to come out for lunch. I've got to get back to New Jersey to pick up my daughter." That was definitely a solid reason for ending our impromptu concert. I was a little disappointed because I was really enjoying myself. So, reluctantly, I handed the guitar back. Dawn tried to stuff it into the case, but it wouldn't close with all the money in there. I estimated, counting the $200 I'd thrown in, she had to have close to $400. Unfortunately, a lot of it was in coins. Dawn scooped out the coins and put them into the pockets and in her purse. Unfortunately, now she jingled like a reindeer. "How are you getting home?" I asked as I followed her out to the sidewalk. "I'll take the bus out of the Port of Authority and transfer when I get to the New Jersey side." "Look, I can't let you do that," I said. "It won't be safe." You sound like a frigging piggy bank. I can't afford to go any other way, she said as she sped up, apparently trying to leave me behind. Wait a minute, I said as I whistled for a cab. I'll pay your cab fare. I told you I don't do weird shit, she with anger in her eyes. I'm not going anywhere with you, I said as I opened the cab door and stepped back. Just tell the driver where you want to go. The cabbie immediately bitched about going to New Jersey. Typical New Yorker. What's it going to cost? I asked, trying to sound snottier than he did. He thought for a second and said, $70. How about 100? I said, holding up 520s. Then I turned to Dawn. I'm only in town for tomorrow. I'll be flying out the day after. If you want to play again, I'll meet you here at 10 in the morning. If you can't make it, that's okay also. But if you do show up, I think you'll do even better than today. As I watched the cab drive away, a germ of an idea had taken seed in my brain on how to get back at Tanya. I would revisit it tomorrow if Dawn showed up. The day before, my wife, Tanya, blindsided me by dropping divorce papers on me. She also had all of our personal and company assets frozen and put a restraining order against me. Tanya accused me of abusing her mentally and physically, which was bullshit. At that point, I thought my life had hit rock bottom, but I was wrong. What brought me to pure despair was when I discovered that Tanya had stolen all the songs I had written. A few of them had great sentimental value, but now they were gone. I knew that she would destroy my originals once she had copied them in her own handwriting. That was really depressing, but that was yesterday. Today, however, when I awoke, I was no longer filled with self-pity. Instead, I was filled with a burning desire to get revenge against my cheating bitch of a wife and her business manager and lover. And I now had an idea about how I might be able to get back at them. And if nothing else, it would restore my self-respect. One of the things that really sent my blood pressure spiking yesterday was their attempt to strand me in New York City for a few days. I realized after the fact that it was done for two reasons. Not only did they want to humiliate me, but Tanya and Todd wanted time to get back to Atlanta and implement their plan. I was sure they wanted to record the stolen songs and spread as many lies about me as they could. They canceled my first-class ticket and replaced it with an economy one for a flight 3 days later to give themselves the time. And I believe they were hoping that I would become enraged and do something stupid. Then they could use that against me. But if Tanya and Todd had let me go back with them the same day, I wouldn't have had that chance to meet with Dawn in Central Park. It didn't take a rock scientist to realize one reason Tanya and Todd wanted to trap me in New York. They believed that if I had no financial resources, I would become desperate. However, they had no idea that I had significant monies in my own name. But as I sat in my hotel room planning my revenge, I knew was I severely limited in what I could do. I couldn't touch them physically, emotionally, or financially at the moment. Oh, the thought of killing both of them had bounced through my head several dozen times. Yet, each time the thought appeared, I discarded it. First of all, I was not a man of violence. But more importantly, that would be too quick and easy. Okay, maybe the first one was the most important, but I truly wanted Tanya to feel whatever pain I could bring down on her for a long time. Even in my shattered condition, it was clear to me what was driving Tanya. She had fallen into the trap that my granddaddy had warned me about all those years ago. Tanya was now totally consumed by becoming a megastar, and she was blind to anything else. That was confirmed when I talked to my old agent, who informed me that Tanya was rebranding her musical image. Of course, her new plans had me totally out of the picture. Tanya also sought to gain publicity and sympathy by portraying me as the evil partner who abused her. But I wasn't going to play their game. I had the smallest glimmer of an idea on how to strike back, and it would all hinge on whether Dawn would show up today, and if she was willing to trust me. It was probably the only way I could ever possibly strike back at Tanya. If possible, I was going to sabotage her new act. Also, I was going to try and make myself a bigger star than she ever could be. However, to do this, I was sure that Dawn was the key to my half-baked plan. If she didn't show up, I wasn't sure what I would do because I had no way to contact her. I didn't even know her last name. Despite my deep concern about whether she would actually show at 10 o'clock, I was filled with a renewed energy. All the time I had played and sang with Dawn, I hadn't been thinking about Tanya. But that night, the pain and self-pity came rushing back in, which brought the tears flowing again. But when the morning arrived, the thought of playing my music caused my self-pity to evaporate. I grabbed a quick shower, breakfast, and headed out. I found a music store that opened at 9 and bought myself a guitar. It wasn't an expensive one, but I'm sure it cost at least 4 times what Dawn's cost her, and mine was a lot better. By 9:30, I was sitting on the stairs waiting. I was convinced that Dawn wasn't coming by 10:20, and I began to pack up my new guitar. I was bitterly disappointed, but as I was getting ready to leave, I saw her hurrying along the street. Dawn was clutching a little girl's hand. She was trying to move as fast as possible, but the small child's short legs limited their speed. "I was afraid that you weren't coming," I said to an out-of-breath Dawn. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry," Dawn apologized. "I couldn't get anyone to watch my daughter." I watched her as she fought to catch her breath. Her eyes showed uncertainty as if she was afraid I'd be mad. She looked up at me with her lips trembling. "Not to worry," I grinned as I held up my new instrument. It gave me a chance to buy a guitar. "Wow, that's a really nice one," Dawn said as she looked between my guitar and hers. "It's not that good, really," I commented as I began tuning it. "Still, it is an upgrade from that old thing you use." As I tuned the guitar, I looked over at Dawn and her daughter. I estimated that the little girl was about 4 or 5 years old, and the resemblance was clear. I also noticed that Dawn had brushed her hair and even put on a little makeup. She wore a different dress today, and it was as threadbare as the other. Dawn was pretty but too much on the thin side. Sadly, her daughter also looked too thin. If they had to survive on what Dawn was making singing in New York City, they were in a bad way. Dawn's daughter hung on her mother's leg, sticking her head out every so often to look at me. Finally, I smiled at her and said, "You're a pretty little girl. Are you going to help us sing?" The girl quickly buried her face in her mother's side. Dawn apologized. "I'm sorry. She's very shy." "No need to apologize," I offered easily. "When I was a kid, I wouldn't even come out of my room if someone came to visit." "Hey," I said suddenly as I remembered I had brought some snacks from the hotel room. There was still plenty of everything after I had the minibar restocked. "Would you like some cookies?" I offered, reaching out with a package of chocolate chip cookies. The little girl looked at the package and then at her mother. Dawn nodded, but Allison wouldn't take them from me. So, I handed them to her mother. She's smart not to take cookies from someone as strange as me. Dawn smiled and then knelt down next to her daughter. "This nice man and I are going to sing some songs. I want you to be a good girl and sit next to me. You can eat the cookies while we play. Can you do that?" Allison nodded, but said nothing. Soon, she was sitting next to her mother, wolfing down the small package of cookies. It was pretty apparent that the girl was hungry. I fished around in my pocket and pulled out a couple packages of granola bars. I tossed them to her. "Here, I don't know if you like granola bars, and it's okay if you don't." Dawn opened the new packet before whispering in her daughter's ear. The little girl nodded and looked over at me and smiled. "Thank you for the cookies." "My pleasure," I said as I returned the smile. "And I still say you're a pretty little girl." The little girl giggled and buried her head in her mother's leg again. "Before we start, I'd like to introduce myself," I said with a smile. "I'm Robbie Wilder, and you are?" Dawn blushed slightly. "Yeah, I guess we didn't introduce ourselves yesterday. I'm Don Samuels, and this is my daughter Allison. Now that we have the introductions out of the way, let's sing," I said as I began to strum my guitar. We started off again with Amazing Grace, which immediately drew a small crowd. As we continued to sing, the crowd grew bigger and the donations dropping into Dawn's open guitar case continued at a steady pace. About 11:30, I decided that we needed a break. I could see that Dawn was getting tired, and Allison was starting to get antsy. "We're going to take a half-hour to 45-minute break," I told the crowd, which had grown to about a 50 or 60. "We're just going to get a bite to eat. So come on back and tell your friends." The crowd groaned a little bit, but then began to disperse. As I put my guitar away, I looked down at Allison. "Hey, little one, would you like something to eat?" Allison's head popped up, and she began nodding. "Do you like hot dogs?" Again, she nodded. "There's a vendor just over there." I motioned with my chin. "I'll get us something to eat and drink. How many would you like?" I asked Allison. "2," she said quietly as she held up 2 fingers. "Allison," Dawn said sternly. The little girl looked down at the ground, then at her mother, and finally at me. "Please." I laughed. "How many do you think your mommy would like?" Allison held up 2 fingers again and smiled shyly. I laughed again. "I can pay," Dawn said as she fished around in her guitar case. I waved her away. "Save your money. This is my treat. I rather suspect that you need the money a whole lot more than I do." "Thank you," Dawn said, nodding. "I made $447.52 yesterday. I was able to pay some of my bills and give some money to my aunt. If I can make that amount today, it will really help Allison and me." "Don't worry, you're going to make more than that today," I said confidently as I headed over to the hot dog vendor. I brought back 6 hot dogs, 10 bottles of water, 2 apples, and a dozen cookies. Both Allison and Dawn ate hungrily. I suspected that they hadn't had any breakfast. As I ate, I realized that I hadn't thought about Tanya or the whole mess I was faced with the whole time we played. However, now that I was thinking about it, my heart squeezed. I felt so totally alone. What filled my head was that I would never find anyone to ever love me again. But then the thought of being able to play my music lifted my spirit some. Also, now I was mentally putting together the pieces to strike back at Tanya. That also helped to soothe the pain within me. Once we finished eating, we moved to a different location. This one had a more wide open space with benches all around. We found a shady location, and Dawn could put her coat on the ground. Allison curled up on it and was soon asleep. We started off the afternoon, once more, with amazing grace. In short order, a crowd began to gather. As the people began to stand 10 and 20 deep, I told Dawn we needed to sing a little louder. I was impressed with the power and purity of her voice. And as we sang, people continued to drop money into the case. After about an hour, I noticed a television reporter standing on the edge of the crowd with her cameraman. After finishing a song, I told the crowd that we were going to take a 5-minute break. Then I walked over to the reporter. "What's up, guys?" I asked. The reporter, who was pretty in that commercial sort of way that most female news reporters seem to look like, smiled at me. "You're Robbie Wilder, aren't you?" I smiled and nodded. "Guilty as charged. Is it true that you and Tanya are getting a divorce?" I remembered what I had been instructed to do to change the narrative Tanya was surely going to push. I shrugged. "Sadly true, but not my choice. According to the reports, she says that you subjected her to physical and mental abuse during your marriage. If you're interested in the truth," I said, working hard to control my anger, "you should talk to all the people who have worked around us all these years. They'll tell you that I'm not an abusive person in any way, shape, or form. The last time I hit someone was in the 5th grade when I punched Jimmy Fuller because he pushed me down. So, what are you doing singing here in Central Park?" The reporter turned the interview in a different direction. I had no idea whether she believed me or not, but I had spoken the truth. I had no idea whether the television station would choose to broadcast my denial or try to spin it in Tanya's favor. The media decided what they believed was true, whether it was or wasn't. But there was nothing I could do about that. I just had to play nice with the reporter and hope they would report what I said truthfully. "It's a beautiful day," I finally responded to the reporter with a smile. "Who wouldn't want to be out in Central Park today? But why are you singing with that girl?" "Oh, Dawn," I continued to smile. "I'm trying to help her earn some money so she can take care of her little girl." I pointed to where Allison was sleeping. I talked to the reporter for about 5 more minutes and made sure she understood that it wasn't just a divorce going on between Tanya and me. I touched on how I had been frozen out of the company, and for good measure, I threw in that Tanya had canceled my plane ticket to fly home on the same flight and replaced it with one for 3 days later. After the interview, I went back to playing and singing with Dawn. About 2:30, Allison woke up and was hungry. That's what I had bought the cookies for. She was as happy as a clam eating her chocolate chip cookies, drinking her water, and listening to her mother and me sing. By 3 o'clock, the crowd had grown to over 100 people, and then the police showed up. They told us we had to call it quits. Everyone dumps on the police, and none more than on the New York City police. And some of it is justified. But the 2 policemen that told us to pull the plug were really nice. In fact, they kept apologizing and telling us it would be all right for us to come back tomorrow. But once the crowd got too big, they'd have to shut us down again. I gave each of them a bottle of water and a cookie. I assured the 2 policemen that it wasn't a bribe. They laughed and wished us well. I was glad the officers didn't know who I was and just treated me like anyone else. I took Dawn and Allison to an early dinner. When they put our placemats down and gave Allison some crayons, she melted our waitress' heart. Allison asked in a tiny voice if it would be okay if she could color one of the pictures on the placemat. Allison said that she'd only color the one and leave the rest for someone else to do. The waitress brought 3 more placemats with more crayons and told Allison to color whatever she wanted. The waitress even brought Allison a special dessert that she didn't charge us for. During dinner, I briefly explained to Dawn the idea rolling around in my brain all day. What I was hoping was that I could set up a new act with the 2 of us. Dawn was very hesitant at first. I kept pressing that it would be a way to make some money to take care of her daughter. Finally, Dawn relented and said that she'd have to talk to her Aunt Claire. I didn't know if Dawn was just trying to blow me off, but I did understand. This was a huge decision for her. I mean, I was asking her to uproot her life and that of her daughter to follow me to Atlanta. I told her I would be fine with whatever decision she made. Besides, I told her that I still had a lot of pieces to pull together, and if I couldn't get everything worked out at the very least, I'd leave my new guitar for her and $500. But if I could pull it all together, then she and her aunt would have to decide if they wanted to come back to Atlanta with me and take a chance on my plan. I told her that I would call in the morning. If they weren't interested, the guitar and the $500 were still Dawn's, and I'd fly back to Atlanta by myself. However, after 3 hours on the phone that night, all the pieces fell into place. Even Alex was on board. He wanted back into the music game, and his doctor had cleared him to work. Alex also told me that Todd had announced that Tanya would be releasing 2 new songs the following week. I was sure that they would be the 2 stolen songs, but there was nothing I could do about it because the songs weren't copyrighted. The thought that Tanya was going to profit from her betrayal just fueled my anger. I so wanted to destroy her, which would be my driving force for years to come. Now I was chasing stardom with every ounce of my fiber. If my grandfather was trying to reach me from the great beyond, I certainly wasn't listening. I watched the newscast that night and was very pleasantly surprised. Apparently, they had done some real investigation. They had contacted some of the people who had worked with me, and those people confirmed that they had seen absolutely no abuse. In fact, all of them stated that as far as they had seen, I was a loving husband who would do just about anything to make his wife happy. Some even said that I was too nice. When a sister station's reporter caught up with Todd, he seemed a little flustered. The reporter told Todd that the people working around Tanya and me didn't confirm the abuse. But Todd was quick on his feet, saying that all of the abuse had happened behind closed doors. He also informed the reporter that Tanya had never reported it for fear that it would damage their act. Todd continued lying and said that Tanya was finally fed up and couldn't take it anymore, so she filed for divorce. When they asked Todd about freezing my assets and changing the airline ticket, he was smooth as silk. He explained that the courts would decide the asset distribution, and the airline ticket had been a simple mistake by the travel agent. I'll give him credit. He was a consummate liar. One part of that news story that I really liked was the part they did about Dawn and Allison. They looked so vulnerable and scared as the cameraman photographed them. And I was especially pleased with the final line of the report. The reporter said, even as Robbie Wilder's career appears to be in a tailspin, he seems more interested in making a mother and her daughter's lives a little better. I had recorded the interview and sent a copy off to Alex. My phone rang a few minutes later. Robbie, that interview was pure gold, Alex said brightly. It's not going to erase what Tanya and Todd have done already, but it will give us a leg up that they never thought we'd have. We talked for another half hour, going over what I needed to accomplish before Alex could begin working his contacts to get my new career launched. There were hundreds of decisions to be made and things to do in the meantime, but to exact my revenge, there was still a big piece that had to be put into place. I had to convince Dawn and her aunt that I wasn't some creep and that my plan was real. So, the following morning, I called Dawn, and she invited me over to New Jersey to meet her aunt. The cab driver on the ride over to New Jersey was as nice as could be. Go figure. A nice New Yorker. I tipped him well. It took a little searching, but I found their apartment, which was a little on the old side. Still, the grounds were well maintained even though the neighborhood was a little seedy. I'd seen worse. The apartment itself was a simple 2-bedroom with 1 bathroom. It was sparsely furnished with a couch and few pieces of furniture in the living room. One bedroom was larger and had a bed and a dresser. The second bedroom only had a queen-sized mattress and some boxes that held Dawn and Allison's clothes. Robbie, this is my aunt, Claire Samuels. Dawn introduced me to her aunt. She is my mother's sister. Claire was a beautiful woman in her early 50s. Her brown hair had streaks of gray, and her face had more than a wrinkle or two. Still, her eyes were bright, and she had a lovely smile. I learned a little more about Dawn and her life. Dawn's parents were both dead. Her father had in a car accident when Dawn was 15. Her mother had died 2 years later from cancer. Then Dawn was married for a short time. She didn't want to talk about her ex-husband other than to say he was possessive and mean. It was clear to me that Dawn's last several years have been exceedingly hard. It took about an hour of explaining, but eventually, both women understood everything and agreed. Actually, it was Claire who finally convinced Dawn that there was nothing for her and Allison in New Jersey or New York. In fact, Claire said there was nothing for her either. She wondered if she could come with us. I was delighted with the idea, and having her aunt coming seemed to ease some of Dawn's fears. It took 2 more days for Claire and Dawn to wrap up their affairs in New Jersey, and by 3:40 that afternoon, all 4 of us were on a plane to Atlanta. Even though the flight was a little less than 2 hours, I was chafing at the bit. I had ideas flooding my brain. There were hundreds of details that needed to be taken care of, from getting Dawn, Allison, and Claire settled to booking studio time somewhere. I also had to get Dawn a new guitar, decide on a new name, and most importantly, begin Dawn's training as a professional singer. Fortunately, Alex would be there to help accomplish much of what needed to be done. My plan was simple. Since Tanya had frozen me out of our singing act, I would create a completely new act with Dawn as my new partner. I was going to start slow and then build up our act, hopefully, to reach the very top of the entertainment world. Or, at least, I wanted Dawn and me to be bigger names than Tanya. That alone would frost my former wife's life. At the same time, Alex and I would be looking for ways to hurt Tanya's career. In my mind, this would go a long way to paying Tanya back. In truth, I didn't believe we could reach superstardom. Still, I was convinced we would be bigger and better than Tanya because I knew my soon-to-be ex-wife's limitations. I was throwing away my grandfather's advice without even a thought, and I intended to work everyone into the ground to get us where I wanted to be. I didn't care who I had to step on to accomplish my goal, but I had no idea what the cost would be and who would ultimately have to pay. Throughout most of my career, I never wanted to be a celebrity. That's why I always let my wife, Tanya, be the face of our group. I never considered myself an entertainer either. To me, I was just a guitar player who also liked to sing. If people wanted to listen to me, that was great, but I was just as happy playing and singing by myself. But then my wife tried to destroy me personally, professionally, and financially. Now I was engaged in an all-out struggle to seek revenge. Tanya had betrayed me, humiliated me, and attempted to destroy my career. If that wasn't bad enough, she also had attempted to cripple me financially and had stolen all of the original copies of songs that I had written. Okay, a lot of the songs weren't all that great, but they were mine, and some of those songs had great sentimental value to me. Plus, I felt certain that the two newest songs I'd written were very good. I have learned over the years that if you work at something long enough, you usually get better. And that was what had happened with my songwriting. Even though I didn't realize it at the time, the songs I was writing now were some of the best of my career, and they would get even better. The flight from New York to Atlanta was a little less than 2 hours. Still, I was going crazy just sitting there with my mind going over the hundreds of things I had to get done to begin my quest for revenge. To quiet my anxiety, I started writing a new song. By the time we reached Atlanta, I had a rough draft for 2 new ones. Cheating was always in your heart and desperate nights but bright tomorrows. Once back in Atlanta, I decided that it would be best to work away from the city. I arranged for Dawn, Allison, and Claire to stay with my parents in Tifton. I originally thought about renting an apartment large enough for the 4 of us, but I thought that would appear too creepy. So, I rented a small apartment for myself not too far from my parents' house. My mom was thrilled with the idea, my dad not so much. Still, he didn't put much of fuss at all. My mom and Claire became instant friends, and they both loved taking care of Allison. However, as much attention as the 2 older women showered on Allison, she took a real shine to my dad. Even though he wouldn't admit it, they had bonded. More times than not, when I would go to visit, Dad would be playing some game with Allison or reading her a book, or she would just be sitting in his lap while he was telling her stories. 2 days after I got Dawn and her family settled, I brought her in a makeshift studio I had thrown together in a rented office. I brought in an instrument teacher to help Dawn learn to play the guitar better. I also brought in a voice coach to help develop her singing style. There were lawyers to meet with, costumes decided on, even a dramatic coach to help Dawn with her stage presence. I was draining my savings, but I didn't care. I drove everyone hard, including myself, but as hard we all worked, no one worked harder than Dawn. She would practice her guitar until her fingers would bleed. Then Dawn would put band-aids on and continue practicing. After a couple of months, she became a fairly good player. Dawn would never be a great guitarist, but she was still pretty good. Finally, when I thought we had progressed significantly, I booked time in an Atlanta studio. I specifically avoided the studio that Tanya and I had used. I could have gone back to that studio as the restraining order had been lifted. But to me, the people in that studio knew that Tanya was cheating and never said a word. They were dead to me. While I was working with Dawn to fine-tune our act, the divorce was proceeding. The squabble over the business was bogged down with the lawyers and accountants. I didn't pay any attention to either. Even though I wouldn't use the old studio, I called the owner and told him why I wasn't returning. I did that because I wanted Tanya to know how much I knew about her betrayal and that there would be consequences. However, when we arrived for our first recording session at the new studio, I thought all my plans would end before they even began. Dawn was absolutely terrified when I put her in front of a microphone for the first time. She would freeze up every time we tried to record something. Fortunately, my mom, Claire, and Allison had come with us. After 2 hours of accomplishing nothing, I was becoming totally frustrated. I didn't know what to do. Finally, I called a halt and told everyone to take an early lunch. I was desperate to get something recorded because the studio was costing a lot of money with the backup musicians and everything. So far, we had nothing. While the musicians were getting ready to put away their instruments, Allison wandered in. She leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "Aren't you going to sing, Mommy?" she asked with her eyes filled with worry. Dawn looked down at her daughter's questioning eyes. She smiled and nodded. "I'm going to sing right now, baby." With that, Dawn stood up and walked up to the microphone. I signaled to the musicians to pick up their instruments. Then I motioned to the control personnel to get ready. Dawn looked over at me, smiled, and nodded. The recording session then began in earnest. It took several hours, but we managed to record the 2 songs I had written on the flight back. Alex released them immediately with as much fanfare as he could rally. The songs did reasonably well with Desperate Nights, but Bright Tomorrows making it to number 12. Cheating Was Always in Your Heart, however, only made it to number 19. These 2 new songs were just to let the public know that my new act was for real. Alex was exceedingly pleased because the new songs accomplished that and more. Tanya, on the other hand, had launched her solo career with a great flourish. There were stories all over the entertainment media, and Tanya made several television appearances. She was smart enough not to push the abuse accusations, saying only that people had different opinions about what constituted abuse. However, the thing that still burned at my soul was that Tanya would use the songs she had stolen from me, and there was nothing I could do about it. But the thought that she had probably destroyed my original copies made me even angrier. I had written one of those songs for my grandfather. It wasn't very good, but my granddaddy had tears in his eyes the first time I played it for him. Most people who knew Tanya well understood that her one consuming goal in life was to become a superstar, and I will give Tanya credit. She was working her butt off to accomplish her dream. However, what Tanya and Todd didn't realize was that while I was building up my new career, I was doing everything I could to torpedo hers. Mostly, I had people putting out true and fictitious rumors about Tanya, anything to tarnish her image. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that my plans would fail miserably. So, I drove everyone even harder. Dawn was just raw talent, but I saw great potential. Alex had agreed wholeheartedly after viewing the news report of us in Central Park on YouTube. I felt blessed that he had decided to come out of retirement to manage Dawn and me. The legal battles had turned into a mess. I only paid attention to what was happening when the lawyers insisted. Aside from the restraining order being lifted and the court granting me limited access to the revenues from Tanya's and my old company, I stopped caring. I knew that eventually, the divorce would be granted and the business problems sorted out. But right then, all I was interested in was revenge. The rumors I had put out were having a minor impact on Tanya's career. But in truth, the limitations of Tanya's ability were what was really holding her back. Still, for me, I had to be a much bigger success than her because only then would I feel like I had truly gotten my revenge. Only then would Tanya realize that I hadn't been holding her back. She had been holding me back. To Tanya, I knew that would be a crushing blow. Like I mentioned, I had never considered myself a celebrity. At our best, I thought Tanya and I were middling B-level singers. We opened for the superstars, played in medium venues with other groups, and headlined in smaller places. But throughout our career together, Tanya was the one our fans wanted to see, not me. But even so, Dawn appeared to be totally intimidated by me. It made it hard to offer any corrections to what she was doing. Finally, I semi-lost it one morning in the studio. After telling Dawn that she was too stiff and to let her body sway with the music, tears began to flow down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wilder," she said with her lips trembling. "I'll do better." "Dawn, please," I said through gritted teeth. "Don't call me Mr. Wilder." This made matters worse as Dawn's whole body seemed to tremble now with more tears flowing. What should I call you?" she asked through a shaky sob. "Call me Robbie or Hey You or Shithead. I answer to all those names. Just don't call me Mr. Wilder. That's my dad." "What's an it head?" Allison asked from the corner of the studio where she had been coloring. I groaned. "Oh boy, I've really stuck my foot in my mouth," I said as I looked at Allison and then down at my shoes. "And these particular shoes taste terrible. I'm sorry, Dawn, that won't happen again." I was greatly relieved that instead of getting upset, Dawn stopped crying and smiled. "What's an it head?" Allison asked again. "It's something I shouldn't have said," I explained to Allison. "It's something people call me when they don't like me." Allison got up, ran to me, and hugged my leg tightly. She looked up at me with a sad expression. "No one should call you that. You're a nice man." I gave Allison a kiss on the top of her head, and she walked back to her corner to continue coloring. I looked over at Dawn, and she nodded at me. "My daughter is right. No one should call you that." I laughed. I still answer to it, though. Dawn laughed, and we went back to work. After that, she started calling me Robbie. Still, it was slow going as Dawn was still totally intimidated by just about everything. She could sing, but her stage presence was very stiff and awkward. At the end of 2 months, I had filed off most of the really rough edges. The rest would have to come with time and experience. I gave Dawn a list of lines that she could offer during the show, and I would play off of those and try to make her look witty and warm. Finally, I decided that we needed to perform to a live audience if Dawn was going to get better. So, after discussing it with Alex, we decided the best place to launch our act was where Tanya and I had begun, at Big Carl's. Alex made the arrangements, and Carl was thrilled. To my surprise, the bar was packed that first night. I was sort of hoping for a half-full bar like it had been when I started with Tanya. Dawn was terrified and threw up shortly before we went on. I wish I could say that once Dawn was up on the stage, she relaxed. But that wasn't the case. She looked like a deer ready to bolt at any second. So, I took over and just sort of left her in the background as I talked to the crowd. I lightly touched on Tanya's and my problems. Then I made a few harmless jokes at Tanya's expense before explaining how Dawn and I met. I painted a picture of how I had found this beautiful flower in the dirty, nasty city of New York. I told them that New Yorkers could be the coldest people in the world, but when Dawn began singing, they stopped and actually smiled. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce the songbird of Central Park, Dawn Samuels. There was a polite amount of applause. Just like we did in Central Park, I said softly to Dawn as I brought her forward. Then I started playing Amazing Grace. When we finished, the room exploded in cheers. Dawn just smiled, shying, and nodded her head. About a third of the way through our performance, Tanya and Todd suddenly appeared. We were in the middle of a song when people began murmuring and standing up to look. Finally, Tanya strutted over to a table that had been reserved for her. That prick Carl never said a word to me. When I looked over at the bar, he was standing there smirking. I smiled back at him. I couldn't be mad because he had warned me that I couldn't trust him. Rather than finish the song, I motioned for Dawn to just stop, and I had her slide back a little. As Tanya moved forward, I realized I could use this appearance to our advantage. I'm sure that Tanya and Todd thought they would upstage us and maybe unnerve Dawn.